Good afternoon. My name is Carmen Zoraida Dominguez. I'm the communications coordinator here at CENTRO. I have the script and I will read it because I get very excited. So, my academic background in anthropology and human rights has shaped my interest in questions of citizenship, sovereignty, and belonging. Questions that sit at the heart of today's conversation and continue to resonate across diasporas and colonial contexts. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel, Across the Political Imagination, Citizenship, and Refusal. This conversation comes at a critical moment as communities across U.S. territories and diasporas continue to navigate questions of sovereignty, identity, and political belonging. Rather than only looking at inclusion within existing political and legal systems, this panel invites us to consider what it means to challenge, refuse, or exist beyond those frameworks. Our panelists bring valuable perspectives on these questions and on the realities of living across multiple political and cultural worlds. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. First, Dr. Emily Mitchell is an assistant professor of geography at Colgate University and the author of New Destinations of Empire, Mobility, Racial Geography, and Citizenship in the Trans-Pacific United States. Her research uses feminist approaches to examine how both empires and decolonization movements shape migration and mobility, citizenship, and politics, particularly across Oceania and Pacific diasporas. Most recently, she co-founded the Critical Islands, Oceans, and Archipelagos Specialty Group of the American Association of Geographers. Our next panelist is Cheonei Lin Pili with It is a health policy researcher scholar funded through Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and her work is broadly situated at the state, race, colonialism, and people's everyday practices of making life. Her work incorporates relational methodologies and Pacifica epistemologies to understand how settler imperialist and historical and contemporary structures impact the lived experiences and identities of people today. We also have Angeli Salinas Muniz, broadly studies hierarchy and subnational access to democracy through the lens of public and elite behavior. Her mixed method dissertation examines how three dimensions of imperialist dependence, autonomy constraints, and displacement shape public understanding, elite strategies, and accountability in Puerto Rico. Our next panelist is Dr. Mara Oxfeld. Oxfeld served as the primary investigator of the Puerto Rico Public Opinion Lab in collaboration with Mayra Velez Serrano and Luis Cámara Fuerte at the University of Puerto Rico. Dr. Oxfeld leads the first representative study of political attitudes in Puerto Rico. Her research sits at the intersection of political psychology and public opinion analysis, with a focus on the relationship between race, media, and political attitudes. And finally, Adrián de León. Adrián de León is an award-winning writer, critic, and political historian at New York University, where he is an assistant professor of history and the culture of SULO, the Global Philippine Studies Initiative. His most recent books are Boondock, a excellent history of Filipino Americans from University of North Carolina Press, Balik Bayan, a reverent history of the Filipino homeland from University of Washington Press, and Notes from Wayward Sons, a memoir, from Bond Street Books. Again, thank you for joining us for this conversation. I'd like to remind you to please put your phones on silent and be mindful of any side conversation. After the presentation and a moderated conversation, we will have time for a Q&A. Please join me in welcoming our first presenter on the stage, Dr. Emily Mitchell Eden.
Good afternoon, muy buenas tardes, half a day. It's so nice to be here with all of you. Let me briefly thank the CENTRO organizers as well as Carmen for moderating this discussion. It's not often that people get to come together. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes. From across such a disparate geography, and so I really feel like this is such a rare gift. There's a quote by Adrienne Maree Brown that I really like to start with sometimes, which is that she says there's a conversation that only the people in this room can have right now. Find it. And that reminds me every time, that grounds me in the fact that we're here together in person, and that's such an opportunity. So, mi ponencia hoy va a ser en inglés, pero he incluido algunas traducciones de texto en español para que se pueda seguir. Y estoy dispuesta también a responder a preguntas en español si alguien prefiere. So I'm going to get my comments in English, but hope you can follow along in text as well. So, as Carmen mentioned, I'm a professor of human geography at Colgate in upstate New York, for those unfamiliar. And my work examines the intersections of migration and colonialism and empire. So historically I focused on the US occupied Pacific, but I'm now working on a second project as well on decolonial horizons and the politics of temporality and time across various contexts, including in Greenland, Puerto Rico, and Northern Ireland. So, but for today I thought it might be useful for me to spend some time talking about my book, which focuses on the context of Marshall Islanders in diaspora, as I wanted to sort of bring attention to the experience of COFA migrants, or migrants from the U.S. COFA states, Compact of Free Association states, which I'll say more about. So I'm going to start out just by talking about the book, and then I will kind of zoom out to the contemporary moment in U.S. immigration politics, to talk a little bit about my new work, and to think about sort of broadly what's happening in terms of this current dumpster fire of immigration, policing and surveillance that we're living in the internal island across the U.S., continental U.S., but also in the territories. Okay. So, just a little bit about the book. There it is. My book briefly tells the story of migration from the Marshall Islands, a former U.S. territory, to Springdale, Arkansas, of the largest sites in the Marshallese diaspora. I hope you forgive me for reading a little bit so I can stay on time. It situates this migration history and present in the context of U.S. imperialism across the Pacific. So in Springdale, where most of the book is based, it examines the history of racialized displacements and the making of what I call an all-white town by design, right? A town that underwent several forms of racialized displacements and exclusions over its history. And that was transformed starting in the 1980s by the arrival of Latine, mostly Mexican and Central American workers and residents, as well as Marshall Islanders. So the book sort of traces out that history and the past 40 years of transformation of this town as a way to tell larger stories about empire, racialization, non-citizenship, and also, importantly, multiracial coalition building among immigrants in Northwest Arkansas. Okay, so a map. I'm a geographer, so so this is a map of some of my field sites for the book. The book came out in 2024, but I started the research for it in 2011, which was sort of spread over a number of different places. And this is kind of a sprawling story of empire. I think a lot about mobility, human mobility, and other forms of mobility in my work. And so my archival work, for example, was mostly conducted in Saipan, in the NMI, and at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. But I also did policy interviews in DC and spent about 5 months in Arkansas doing art interviews, oral histories, attending community meetings, and that sort of thing. So this is also a quick primer to the geography that I'll be talking about today. Okay. So just first a little bit of history about the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, which has come up a couple of times this conference. So from the end of World War II until the mid-1980s, and for Palau a little bit later, into the 90s, this area that you're looking at here, you can see the sort of, is that what either was? The size reference here in this inlay map, was a UN Trust Territory administered by the UN Trust Territory administered by the US. So in essence, a massive US colony, right? And I often think of the joke made by Robert Underwood, former delegate from Guam to the US House of Representatives, and former UOG president, who said, we had the trust and they had the territory. They referred to the Americans. Right? So during this time, I'll just mention that the U.S. Conducted extensive military training and testing, including extensive nuclear testing across the Marshall Islands. Which had, some of you may be familiar with it, had really devastating consequences for the land and water and human and non-human bodies. So at the mid-1980s, the countries that made up the trust territory started to become independent through multiple years of negotiations and deliberations and plebiscites, including the Federated States of what is now the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands and Palau, the CNMI, or Commonwealth of the North Mariana Islands, became a U.S. Commonwealth. I know I'm running sort of quickly over some of this history, but just to give a bit of context briefly. So they became independent, but they partly did that through the elaboration of a compact of free association with the United States. Now, what is a compact of free association? I go into this at much greater length in my book, but you could think of it as a shorthand as a kind of bilateral agreement, but of course it's between a former colonial power and its former colony, right? So massively uneven power differentials. It's an incredibly vast sort of set of arrangements. It covers pretty much every area of life, economic provisions, environmental provisions. Notably, it also gives the U.S. Exclusive base rights over the lands and waters of the Marshall Islands, including Kwajalein Atoll, that was just extended until 2086, so quite extensive. And it also gives Marshall Islanders the right to visa-free migration to live, work, and study in the United States without a visa indefinitely. So a very unique immigration status. They are Marshallese citizens, right, that traveling with a unique provision to enter the U.S. 5 minutes, okay. So I'm going to refer to that unique immigration status as COFA status, or compact free association status, in this talk. Okay, so just like another geographical reference for you there. When Marshall Islanders, after 1986, started traveling to the U.S. with this new status, they usually came by way of Hawaii, and they started to encounter some trouble, right? Here's where their immigration status starts to produce some confusion. So I want to just briefly show you a document that I have in my book. This was a document that was photocopied, as you can see, several times, given to me by a Customs and Border Patrol officer, and I just want to sort of translate it for you a little bit. So here's what it says at the top, this little text up here says, there are hundreds of islands in the Pacific Ocean. You may be totally, as a CBP officer, you may be totally befuddled. You have no idea where these islands are. This is a kind of, I think of it as a kind of imperial cheat sheet. So the first category says U.S. immigration status. The second column says island groups, and third says political status. So I just offer this as an example of what I theorize in my book as imperial citizenship, right? This sort of range of political statuses and immigration statuses that often sort of chop up our archipelagic regions. I think we could probably imagine something similar being made about the Caribbean. And that not even the people supposedly in charge of monitoring these human flows even oftentimes know where these islands are, what kind of relationship they have to the U.S. So that can produce a lot of challenges. Okay, so Marshall Islanders start to arrive at Springdale, and they're arriving to a town that is rapidly being transformed by poultry work, by chicken factories. I mentioned earlier that had undergone racial transformations. It was not only a site in the Trail of Tears, but also a sundown town. So its black residents were excluded from living there after sundown. So there's a lot of interesting racial dynamics in this town, as I mentioned. I'll just go through this briefly in the interest of time. So I mentioned earlier that Marshall Islanders have this unique status that can cause some problems. Right, so they have all sorts of rights that may look, and in some ways are very preferential to, for example, what undocumented migrants have, or migrants with DACA or Dreamer status. But they also face a lot of precarity because it's this sort of fine print status. So, for example, they are legally deportable, right? They're convicted of crimes. But as you can see here, this is a quote from, sorry, that's so hard to read, a Marshallese court interpreter, right, who's talking about, a Marshall Islanders only need a passport and an I-94, which is a little paper that proves that they entered the country, crossing the border, but that little things could add up and that someone could easily be deported. So in practice, that precarity is sort of carried by Marshall Islanders through their everyday encounters, and I can give other examples of that in the Q&A. right? Including, for example, ineligibility, long-time ineligibility for Medicaid, which is recently overturned. So let me briefly go to then what's happening now, right? Sorry, the colors totally changed, so some of this is hard to see. What's happening now under Trump 2.0? Just some headlines here from Northwest Arkansas. We're seeing spikes in detentions and deportations of Marshall Islanders, as well as other Micronesians and Palauans, right? Even being transported through Guantanamo, for example. So this is really new, right? This is not that people weren't experiencing deportations before, but it was in very, very small numbers. Now I think upwards of 100 Marshall Islanders were deported last year, and some have said that they're being targeted also for deportation. Sometimes they also get swept up in raids on mostly Latinx work sites as well. People, of course, in places like Arkansas are resisting, pushing back on that, the kinds of repression that they're facing, often in collaboration and coalition with Latinx organizers, as you see here, and also forming organizations like ACOM and MBI, which are Marshallese-led organizations that are really taking prominence in this area and leading the struggle for lots of different fronts, right? Immigrant rights, nuclear justice, etc., climate change. Okay. Again, just mentioning an increase in deportations. COFA migrants also, for example, living in the Marianas, that just experienced super typhoon Sinlaku, also facing issues accessing benefits, right, from FEMA because of their unique status. So that's something that they often come up against, right? And I just want to wrap up with a few comments about my newer work and trying to draw out some of these connections across different territories and regions. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I've started to do more work on a recent project, part of which has focused on Puerto Rico and the ICE raids in Puerto Rico, especially targeting Dominican neighborhoods. And so these are a couple of photos from my time in San Juan that, as ICE raids have kind of swept across the island, and organizations like ACLU Puerto Rico, Kilómetro Cero, Comuna Caribe, La Cole have been organizing to protect their migrant neighbors. And so in this, just to finish on this point, what I'm sort of arguing in a new essay that I'm working on is that to understand the politics of ICE raids in Puerto Rico, we have to understand a long history of colonial dynamics that includes practices of informal sanctuary that go back to sort of times of marinage between Dominicans, for example, and Puerto Ricans, but also we have to understand sort of levels of government complicity at the level of the Puerto Rican state to sort of understand why people might be complicit with ICE or kind of in support of their current policies there. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and look forward to talking more about this.
Okay, Ho'opalava everyone. Olo'oingoa Oshione Lynn. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Oshione Lynn Keeley Lister. It's so great to be here with all of you today. I would like to begin by telling you a little bit about who and where I'm from. So I'm Samoan, born and raised in Washington State. My mom, Catherine Lister, is white American from California with English and Irish settler roots. My father, Timilili Pilileo, is from Utule Tutuila in American Samoa, and then my stepfather, Asmi Luhu, is from Endemia, Algeria. So my research is very much informed by the people and places who I carry with me, some of which are photographed here, and this work is not mine. It's woven from the collective dreams and imaginations and labor of so many who came before me, walked beside me, and will come after. And so I just want to start by taking a moment to welcome mine and yours into this space with us. Any photos that you see from here on out were taken from my time spent in the islands of Tutuila and Upolu. And I just hope that the photos provide a sense of place while I share some stories and history. And so Tutuila is part of American Samoa, while Upolu is independent Samoa, what was Western Samoa. Just for context. Okay, great. So the stories and findings that I share with you today are part of a chapter from my dissertation work, which is on identity, belonging, and political possibility in 3 of the 5 U.S. territories: American Samoa, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. My dissertation is just one piece of my larger research program, which is generally an investment in understanding colonial citizenship subject making within a settler imperial state like the United States. My project isn't comparative. I take a relational approach, which means I'm really listening to understand how our stories are connected to one another's. And so for today's presentation, I focused on my conversations with Samoans and my time spent in American Samoa. This work is very much still ongoing, so I just say that to kind of clarify the still in motion nature of what I share. And I just want to clarify a little bit about status and citizenship, because that's one of our topics today, which is that I spoke to many people, many Samoans who were US nationals, some who were citizens themselves, some who were born in American Samoa, others in the States, and so status and citizenship is not a consistent part of my sort of like sample selection. So the stories will vary a little bit, and so just keep that in mind. One of the threads that I'm sharing about today is what I'm calling judicial law. And so this builds off of what in Samoan we call law, but this exists in many other Pacific islands. It might be spelled a little differently or have a little bit different of a meaning, but it essentially captures how space and relationships are constitutive of one another. This is comparative or different from settler colonial understandings of space, where space is considered property, something that can be owned, possessed, dispossessed, and it's devoid of any relational responsibility. And so I use judicial law to think about how the law and legal status structures the relational condition between American Samoa and the US, and therefore Samoans and the US. So across the communities I spoke with, this includes Puerto Ricans and Virgin Islanders, citizenship affects, it affects who leaves, who returns, who can stay. It affects who sponsors family, who maintains land ties, who continues to have ties to culture, language, and who belongs politically, sort of technically, and who feels like part of the body politic. And so for American Samoa, and Samoans specifically, citizenship was never really debated as sort of a question of rights acquisition. Instead, it was framed as a question of relational consequence. And the people I spoke with were often navigating in their stories overlapping obligations to land, family, mobility, care, governance, military service, economic survival, indigeneity for some, and legal exclusion. Skip over that. So the folks I talked with were rarely simply sort of pro-citizenship or anti-citizenship. Instead, they spoke of citizenship in the terms of relational contradiction. So people wanted voting rights, but they feared incorporation. They valued mobility, and they worried deeply about cultural erosion. They deeply distrusted US governance, but they also reckoned with their reliance on US institutions and feared further reliance. So through their stories, two things were clear. First, they viewed citizenship as something itself that's a relationship. And second, that citizenship was seen as a condition that would shape their other relations. And so I'll next move to 4 different Samoan women that I spoke with, and I'll share some of what they shared with me. So I'll start with Anna. For Anna, she is a US national, and at the time we spoke, our conversation really, covered many different things, but when we were talking about the possibility of status and citizenship in American Samoa, she shared, even if I were a citizen, I think I still wouldn't feel American. And I included this quote to connect to more socio-legal scholarship, which views citizenship as more than a bundle of rights, but as a right to be seen and feel represented by the government that claims you. And so Anna is sort of speaking to this here. Next, I'll share a little bit about Lei. Lei was born in Lei was born in California, but grew up in American Samoa. And so when we talked about sort of the consequences of status and the realities of American Samoa's unique status, she shared this story. When she was born, she had to have a life-saving procedure very soon after. And so she heard the story over and over again growing up, and the story would always end with someone saying, "Thank God you were born here." And so that really speaks to something I saw firsthand, and for those who've been on island know, and this is shared across islands, is there's a real lack of medical infrastructure and support. And so for Lei and her family, citizenship was complicated because it was kind of seen as sort of a source of possibility or hope. Maybe things could be different. What if like this happens again? And also, of course, they live in the contemporary world and understand the complications of what sort of citizenship and that could mean for American Samoa. Next, I'll share about Longy. Longy really shared her frustration about what this conversation about citizenship always looks like. And she says these conversations in diaspora or in American Samoa, that they always talk about people, they always talk about rights. But for Longy, she was really concerned about the land. And so she said that citizenship, it's about the status of the land, not the status of the people. And I share this to just sort of add, I think, an important perspective that is especially true in American Samoa, but it's true, of course, across, which is that so much of our land is still communally owned in American Samoa. So there's sort of a unique point that, or fear and worry and anxiety about what could change in the future, especially when looking at our island neighbors. And last, I'll just share a little bit from Melly. So Melly was born and raised in diaspora, and I think this is an experience that many of us in diaspora have, which is that she went through this sort of experience of learning about the history of colonialism and imperialism and reckoning with her own perspectives on this versus the generational sort of narratives that were inherited for her. And so for her, when we were talking about citizenship and status, she said, you know, now it's military bases, now it's mining, but it really takes us away from who we actually are, and it puts us back in survival mode. And so for Melly, anything that sort of increased the connection with the state, the Southern Imperial State, was something that increased imperial dependence and something that Melly was, did not want at all. So to end, I'm going to just share a story. And this is about a court case that I got to sit in on when I was in American Samoa. And so this case, it was a dispute over land. And so compared to sort of more like settler legal claims to land, where maybe if we imagine this is happening in the States, someone would be asked to sort of establish record of ownership, maybe deeds, contracts, that sort of thing. In American Samoa, this quote-unquote claim to land was based on who could sort of establish the longest enduring relationship with the land. And so in this, when I was sitting, listening to the sort of arguments on both sides, I heard stories of who built this specific staircase on the land, who built it and how that story was passed down from generations, why it was built, a certain grandfather that couldn't make it up the stairs anymore. I heard stories of who worked the land, who had made decisions about the land. And so afterwards I was talking with an auntie about how different land and housing is there versus in the States. And she jokingly said, you know, people in the States, like, we have to pay rent or we have mortgage, but here our culture is our mortgage. And I end with this just to connect that this story, this is how participants also approach citizenship from those that I spoke with. And so they rarely discussed it as an individual entitlement. Instead, they really evaluated citizenship through its consequences for relationships. And this includes their relationships to land, family, community, and future generations. So, Fakate, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Hello everyone, thank you so much to the panelists for their wonderful work, and thank you all for being here with us. This is work in progress that I'm doing with my colleague Mara Osco, and we're excited to hear your thoughts. Let's see which way this goes. Well, not that way. So we know in this space that territories have limited representation, the federal government, they have limited sovereignty. And as a way to address this, political leaders in the territories have organized plebiscites where residents are given a set of options on political status to decide on. However, whatever results as the winner of these elections is often taken as to mean that this is the full democratic choice, the full expression of the will of the people of these territories. However, in our work, we question to what degree do these results and times where residents are made to give strong preferences or express in limited ways what they prefer, to what degree is that actually an expression of democratic choice, or as the UN resolution would call it, their freely expressed will. Because if we draw from scholars like Mill, we can learn that a choice is not really a democratic choice unless there's more than one viable option. And building on scholars like those in the room, like Bevacua's scholarship on the decolonial deadlock, we asked, one, do residents of the territories believe that they have more than one viable option? Second, how do perceptions of viability or possibility shape these status preferences? And third, can perceptions of viability be shifted? And we, to answer these questions, we draw on several methods, and today we'll present focus groups and surveys. So, talking about the focus groups, we were able to host 14 focus groups between Puerto Rico, Guam, and the U.S. Virgin Islands with the help of wonderful community partners in each of these islands and archipelagos. I'll name Michaela Glass and Manny Daniel here. And what we find overall is that among these three territories, there is this perception of constrained viability without the United States. By that I also mean limited possibility of survival without the United States. And there's been important literature done on inferiority, on colonial mentality, on class consciousness, and the ways these things impact how people who have been colonized behave and their preferences on status, but that's not the main references that we see through these conversations. What we see is that people are really drawing on references to capacity, much like we would see the students in our Sea of Islands essay asking their own teacher. And to give an example of these, we have a respondent from the Guam focus group that says, we rely on tourism, that's our main industry here. And until we can think of another sustainable industry, our chances of becoming independent and staying independent are slim. In the other side of the world, a resident from the U.S. Virgin Islands says, we're tourism based, and I wish there was some other industry that we've had. We've become, through history and through other people's profit, dependent people. Something else that comes up in these focus groups that is not untied to the concept of capacity, and that someone asked a question, I believe in the plenary yesterday, is what we're calling for now the shadow of the alternative. Is how places, neighboring places, but not only, can be used as examples of what would be likely to happen if their relationship with the United States were to change. And in the Caribbean, Haiti and Cuba are often used as these examples. So we have a participant from the U.S. Virgin Islands saying, we know how the United States acts when people say that they don't want to be part of it, like Cuba. We have a lot of examples of the negative effects of demanding your freedom. In Puerto Rico, someone says, can there be an independent country such as Haiti that is more enslaved than we are to the economic interests that govern the world despite being independent? It is as simple as that. That is how the world unfolds. So I want to highlight in these cases that many of these conversations are not uncritical of the structurals and dependence and violences that they are in, but they still highlight these specific narratives. And it is the people who highlight these narratives that are more likely to support statuses that are in closer proximity to the United States. But we also found a lot of counter narratives in these focus groups. So while there are participants who focus on lack of capacity, there's others that focus on the expansion and possibility of that capacity. So this is a quote from a Chamorro woman in Guam that says, you really need to believe in our human potential, right? And capacity. And I think that's part of colonization's casualties. It's a death imagination, right? If we have to bet, we have to bet on us being able to do it. And across the territories, in Guam, we find references to places like Fiji. In the U.S. Virgin Islands, we find references to places like Antigua. In Puerto Rico, we find references to what we read as being this Asian country. We assume it's Singapore that they're talking about, as places where people can use to imagine sovereign alternatives. So overall, we find that residents have constrained viability and options. However, many of them, those who are able to imagine other possibilities and are able to take other places as reference, are more likely to express wanting more sovereign relationships. And I'll pass it to Meta.
Yeah, so we were really grateful to the participants in the focus groups to help us really delve into some of the thinking behind a lot of these preferences. But we next wanted to explore how, like, on a broader level, how representatives were amongst the opinions of the territories we were studying. So we started off with a representative territory-wide survey, multimodal. This was done in partnership with students and faculty at La Universidad de Puerto Rico, and then also a territory-wide multimodal survey in the U.S. Virgin Islands. We're currently doing a survey in Guam as well. And the first thing we just wanted to understand is we always refer to all these plebiscites. We know that there's a lot of issues with the plebiscites that we often refer to. There's turnout, there's bias and question wording, there's people who abstain and try to take a movement and a position through doing so. And so we just wanted to get a baseline about when we asked about favorability towards the different statuses, how favorably do different residents of these territories view the different statuses. And so what you can see here is that it's actually much more dispersed than we might imagine from looking at the results of plebiscites, but still there's overwhelming support for statehood and the current territorial status stands out relative to independence in both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The next thing we wanted to do was better understand this sentiment that we were observing in a lot of our focus groups about this inability to survive without the U.S. And that's really the constraint that we understood when we think about, like, are you choosing something because it's actually what you want versus this is the only path to survival, that Hobson's choice that Gigi previously referred to. And what we found is really strong endorsement of this belief that you need the U.S. to survive. It's not just that I want to be affiliated with the U.S. or some, idealization of modernity, but there's a widespread belief that the U.S. is needed to survive, not only economically, but to have a trustworthy government, in both the FBI and Puerto Rico, and the possibility of developing a strong economy is not probable without the U.S., and that it would be difficult to sustain the population without the U.S. Here referring to what others refer to as beliefs in, like, food sovereignty. The thing we really wanted to understand was how much is this shaping, how much is this conditioning status preferences? And what we found is what you might imagine and what might, at initial glance, what might not even seem super surprising. That is, those who thought it was impossible to survive without the U.S. along any of those metrics were much more likely to support statehood and ELA in Puerto Rico and the current territorial status in the Virgin Islands than those who thought it was actually possible to survive along any of those dimensions without an affiliation with the U.S. And then the inverse was true for independence. Those who think it is possible to survive without the U.S. are actually much more likely to support independence, which provides some initial support for this idea that these are not actual choices when we ask about what's your preferred status, but these are kind of forced preferences or perceptions of reality. If you really wanted to get into our regression coefficients, which some listeners really like, I think what we really wanted to highlight here is when we put, what we're looking for is how much these blue lines stand apart from that vertical dashed line, because that means statistically significant predictor of the outcome we're looking at. And so when we look at support for statehood, what we see is that even when we factor in these other things that we might believe are associated with support for statehood or independence, that belief in whether you can survive without the U.S. is the strongest predictor of support for statehood. And so it really highlights that this perception of political feasibility and the possibility of survival is conditioning preferences in both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, above and beyond these other factors that we've found to be associated with it. The same is, of course, true for support for independence. Those who believe it's actually possible to survive without the U.S. are significantly more likely to support independence. So in this last minute, I'm going to highlight this experiment. And so what we really wanted to understand was, is it even possible to shift these viability beliefs? And experiments are done all the time in political science. We often show one person this message and this other group another message, and we look at, does it actually shape your preferences on the issue in an online survey experiment? And we really wanted to draw on the narratives that we saw emerging in our focus groups and that we saw emerging throughout social media, early childhood literature, adult literature, highlighting that these alternatives are in fact possible. Survival is possible. Turning to narratives about things that Palau has done with banning commercial fishing. Turning to narratives about this really innovative hydroponic farming system that was developed at the University of the Virgin Islands. These aren't common narratives, but when they're known, they're really powerful. Maybe it's just making these more widely available. And so we created what we did this online survey experiment in both Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, and we assigned people to getting what we refer to as a quiz, kind of like a New York Times news quiz, just for fun, like, hey, did you know, or like fun facts. So the treatment was getting this information about these possibilities. The treatment was getting information about, hey, Singapore was a colony for 150 years, and now it's thriving. Getting these treatments about, look what Palau did, look what is happening at the University of the Virgin Islands. Look at these resources that all these people are turning to for energy and are uniquely concentrated in different territories. When we assign people to this, did it affect their preference, their beliefs, and their viability constraints, versus if they were just given like a random fun fact about science, like starfish and I think snakes don't have bones and stuff like that. And we actually found that it did not. It did not shape these viability constraints. And so our big ask to you is, what is your take on this? We could walk away and we could think of a couple things. The one obvious takeaway from all this is that the current plebiscites clearly fall short of decolonization standards in terms that we're not really providing people with a true choice. People clearly don't think they have multiple options. We try to highlight that these high viability constraints are distorting people's ability to express their true preferences on issues as critical as the status of the governance in which they live under. And the thing that we really want your feedback on is it's really unclear whether these salient narratives that seem to be shaping people's preferences can be shifted. Was it that are the ones that we highlighted, perhaps those just weren't good ones, those weren't powerful ones, maybe everyone doesn't like a news quiz as much as Gigi and I do. Maybe it's the one-time thing. Maybe we found in other contexts in political science that one-time treatments can be effective at shifting, political preferences in the short term. And so we'd love your thoughts on that. And I'm getting a strong cue to stop talking.
Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. My name is Adrian De Leon. And this is both new work and not. I've been doing field work and archival research in the Pacific Northwest for the past 8 years. This is a project I had begun in 2019 and 2020, but then had come back to recently, as my interests have taken me into terrain, I think, that has expanded beyond what I built my career off of so far, which is thinking about the kind of imperial world system through Filipino migration, towards a broader history of comparative empires, and thinking about diasporas, especially colonial diasporas like the Philippines and Filipino migration, as an analytic and not just as a case subject. So right now, this is a sliver of a project that I'm currently thinking about on an imperial history of the New Deal told through its colonial subjects. Yes. I just also want to shout out some folks on the spot, yes. Because that historiography, that should be stale, I just want to shout out some folks I see in the room also who have been influencing my thinking on sovereignty, non-sovereignty. Jadwar Bonilla over there, it's good to see you again. And Professor Rose Cleason, who is, or as well, legal scholar at Rutgers, it's good to see you also. I want to launch my comments here first based on an early plenary comment in an earlier panel that independence and political independence, which I think is the theme of today, is not necessarily freedom. It's not necessarily the kind of unconditional, right, post-imperial decolonization, that imperial modes of decolonization, which really take shape in and around the New Deal era, right, the 1930s, which is my focus of study, promise, right, as a form of reorienting American imperialism from British-style form of colonialism towards this kind of extraterritorial, pointillist form that takes shape after World War II, right? So here's where I will begin. On February 2013, in the tribal leadership of the American side Nooksack Nation forcibly disenrolled or issued disenrollment notices to 306 members of mixed Native and Filipino descent peoples. Right? Early arguments revolve around their insufficient blood quantum. Nooksack Nation requires a minimum of 1/4 Nooksack blood to use the blood quantum logics as put forward through since its constitutional or the federal recognition of its constitution in 1973. They met those requirements, right? The entire kind of premise behind this case, or the kind of economic unconscious of this case, is that the tribal leadership wanted to kick out a large swath of political rivals, right, and rival kind of political or rival families within the nation in order to concentrate. This is common among smaller tribes in the United States, right? In order to concentrate casino wealth, right, onto a smaller set of the Nooksack Nation, right? Then tribal, once that failed, right, in August of the same year, a judge halted disenrollment, but proceedings continued anyway. And what they used was they identified, they cherry-picked a 1942 census, right? About 30 years before the tribe itself was federally recognized, right? So those census rolls were conducted through the Tulalip jurisdiction in the Pacific Northwest, and Nooksack until 1973 was generally an off-reservation nation. That was self-governing but not federally recognized, right? They identified a common ancestor named Annie George, who was putatively absent from the tribe's census rolls in 1942, mind you, in World War II. It's very important. 3 decades before the tribe was federally recognized, right? Represented by the law firm Galanda Broadman, which specializes in indigenous law, what is now called the Nooksack 306 case has risen all the way to the U.S. government, to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to Housing and Urban Development, and to the United Nations, which issued an urgent call to the U.S. government to intervene in the Nooksack case in 2022, which was ignored by the tribal leadership. Some other things here to note as well, just for the dates, just because I think, who's heard of the Nooksack 306 case before? Very new. It's quite urgent, and the fight is still ongoing. Just to give you a sense, it's been going on since 2013. In October of 2016, disenrollment was administratively finalized. The Nooksack 306, all mixed Filipino and indigenous, lost citizenship, healthcare, voting rights, and claims to their property. In December 2016, the Bureau of Indian Affairs threatened to pull federal funding, and in a month later, joined by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the BIA steps in, refuses to recognize the disenrollment, and withheld $14 million from support. So it's these subjects are caught between multiple kind of imperial and sub-imperial jurisdictions, or forms of sovereignty, right? In 2021 and 2022, the tribal government continued to stage new eviction proceedings, and the UN intervenes here in 2022, and it is still ongoing. They were forced off their land. And in the comments, I could tell you what happened in 2024, 2025, and the kind of aftermath of their forced evictions. Here's what I'd like to talk about. First, the common ancestor, Annie George, is a historical subject that has become the pivot point for the leadership's land grab and the Puerto of casino profits and also political power. Annie George was also the daughter of a historic Nooksack chief who, by virtue of pure historical coincidence, could not receive a homestead allotment in 1846 with the Oregon Treaty that split the U.S. and Canada border. So we're bringing British Empire into this picture as well, right? Number 3, the U.S.-Canada border bisected the Nooksack into British and American settler regimes. All right, number 4, Annie George was actually adopted. So she was by genealogy Nooksack through her father. Her biological mother had passed away. Her father remarried, and the second wife formally adopted, and who was from the American side, formally adopted Annie George into the nation on the American side, right? So her father stayed on the Canadian side, which is why he couldn't come down, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Mind you, post-1973 by Nooksack law, adoption counts for enrollment as well as traditional genealogical membership, right? Enrollment is a form of citizenship that is imposed through the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, which we'll talk about, right? And genealogical citizenship is far older than that, right? Number 5, Annie George's daughters married Filipino men, mostly during World War II. Fellow colonial subjects brought as migrant workers all over the U.S. West Coast, Hawaii, and Alaska. Number 6, the 1942 census chosen, many indigenous women were actually absent from the census calls, or from the census rolls during World War II, as they became farm workers for the war effort, right? They entered into the domestic warfare economy, including indigenous women from Canada who were escaping the residential school system, coming down by provisions of the Jay Treaty, right? And they often worked all over the Pacific Northwest, as well as in the Central Valley of California, grapes, asparagus, strawberries, etc., right? There remains to be a systematic history of indigenous labor migration done in the American West, which is a future project that somebody takes up as well. And the other point I want to make here is that U.S. empire in the Pacific, along with British imperialism in Canada, shaped tribal disenrollment in this region inter-imperially and trans-imperially, right? So what to make? What can we make of this case? And why, you know, for what can in particular, what can the Philippines and Filipino migration introduce into the growing body of scholarship on tribal disenrollment? One of the arguments I want to make is that tribal disenrollment, right, which comes in its current form from the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, which is called the Indian New Deal, right, kind of colloquially, its settler colonial function is that it does not allow for other kinds of trans-colonial and trans-indigenous relationalities, right, that emerge, right, out of the geographies of empire and colonial capitalism across the Pacific that brought northern Philippine men, right, not necessarily Tagalog, but northern Philippine men and indigenous women from the Canadian US side together, right? So I want to kind of stage the early sketches of a counter reading of that, right? Let's see what else. And some of the things I just kind of want to go through, right, is to emphasize that the Nooksack, part of the crisis that resulted in the Nooksack 306, can really be traced to the early conquest of the Pacific Northwest, right? So the 1846 Oregon Treaty, right, set the kind of putative borders between British Canada and the United States of the Pacific Northwest, right? And it's important here that Annie's father, the Nooksack chief Matsky George, remained on the Canadian side in contemporary Abbotsford, BC, and did not receive a homestead allotment. He just wanted to stay home, right? In 1855, 9 years later, 2 treaties, the Port Doe Point and Port Elliot treaties, due to inclement weather, Nooksack representatives were not present, and the Lummi Nation representative in absentia signed away their ancestral lands, and thus the Nooksack did not receive early federal recognition in the 19th century. Right? Nooksack, on a case-by-case basis, had since claimed some homestead lands through individual claims. Right? And then the Dawes Act in 1887, this completely destroyed 19th century forms of tribal governance and reallocated land to individuals and families as private property, as individual parcels and allotments, right? Leaving surplus lands available for white settlers and federal claims of eminent domain. The Nooksack were thus doubly excluded due to their lack of federal recognition, right? So they received none of this private property either, right? Because that depended on whether or not you had a reservation, right? So they, by and large, until 1973, they were an off-reservation nation, right? And then this is also happening at the same time as the Pacific Northwest is becoming deeply embedded in U.S. imperialism in the Asia Pacific as well, right? So just to highlight some of the political economic integration, right, the nexus of railroad and maritime trade, right, the militarization of naval imperialism, Fort Ward and Bainbridge Island, Puget Sound, Naval Shipyard, Fort Lawton and Seattle, right? The Pacific Northwest becomes a central node for both the Asian migration, right? Also the commodity flows across the Pacific into North America, right? But also the projection, the early 20th century projection of military power across the Pacific, right? Which then incorporates places of the Pacific Northwest into places like Hawaii, Yokohama, and Manila, of course, right? After the Treaty of Paris in 1898. Commodity export, including agriculture, fishing, and canning, lumber, and Alaska gold, right? These are the Pacific Northwest was a resource hinterland as well as a growing urban site. Also, fun fact: Skid Road, which becomes Skid Row, comes from Seattle, right, and the logging industry. Asian and indigenous labor migration, right? So Filipinos through the U.S. national category are able to move to the continental United States as migrant workers. and the Canadian First Nations through Jay Treaty in 1794. And lastly, the Pacific Northwest also concomitantly becomes embedded into U.S. imperialism in the Pacific through its processes of border making, surveillance, and migration exclusion. A lot of Asian American scholars have written about this work as well, but I just kind of want to bring that into relation with other historiography. So, here's where it gets funky, and I'll end on this, right, as a kind of like set of questions I want to talk about, right? Self-governance, if we look at, the historiography on the New Deal has come to start to understand Indian reorganization and tribal self-government as a part of FDR's policies, as a kind of broader picture of, how minoritized subjects experience the New Deal, right? But the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which granted putative Philippine independence, right, over a 10-year period before full independence, is not talked about in New Deal historiography at all, by and large. But once you bring them together, right, as an avenue into thinking about the relationships between indigenous and Filipino people as they migrated to the Pacific Northwest, we see how self-government, the principles of self-government, the principle actually stands in for the principles of natives administering their own colonization, right? Likewise, it becomes a set of principles to preserve private property under the guise of creating a new liberal form of imperialism, both domestically and also abroad, right? And to gain federal recognition, both tribes, but also the Philippine colonial government, needed to submit a US-style constitution. These are forms of imperialism by other means, even and especially at the moment of what we now call formal decolonization, right? So I just want to think about the ways that migration, the histories of indigeneity migration actually helps to scale up these larger histories, geopolitical histories of sovereignty, non-sovereignty, et cetera. Happy to talk more about it in the comments, but thank you for listening.
Thank you for your presentations. Now I invite the panelists to share the table. Thank you for your presentation. They are wonderful. I have learned a lot today. I'm very excited about this panel. I sent like 100 questions to the panelists, but we have time only for a few. I wanted to start with a simple question. The title of this panel invites us to look beyond traditional discourses of equality and thinking about citizenship. My question is, how do you define citizenship in your respective research?
It's a tricky question, and it's one that I think my thinking on has changed quite a bit over the course of my work. When I talked about my book, I looked quite a bit, in the context of coastal migrants, at the ways that non-citizenship or sort of limited forms of citizenship serve to limit rights, render imperial subjects illegible to the state at lots of different levels, including focusing on the local level. So really concretely, what does it look like when Marshall Islanders try to get housing assistance or apply for FAFSA or apply for food aid, free lunch, right? Those sorts of things. And I think, we're visiting the question of citizenship under the current moment of terms of basically genocide of immigrant populations in the U.S., especially Latinx populations. I am thinking a lot more about how citizenship functions, especially for imperial subjects, as it's a carrot that's dangled, it's a stick that's used to threaten populations if they sort of act out or make claims on rights. It can often sort of function as a wedge between different marginalized groups. I didn't talk about this much in my talk, but between different racialized groups, for example, between Marshallese coastal migrants and undocumented Mexican workers, right, who might find much common cause. Citizenship or forms of rights based on citizenship can really form a wedge between those groups that might otherwise form coalitions together. So increasingly, I actually feel like citizenship is while a very important source of rights for some, in this moment, especially where we're seeing it crumble for many people, many groups that sort of tell themselves as protected, are pretty shaky basis for a foundation of movement, solidarity. And so how can we think about sort of the importance of protecting people's rights to livelihood and life, in fact, but not rested upon sort of these individual rights of citizenship because of the risks and because of the way that it's so precarious and ephemeral. It can do more damage, I think, often for coalitional movements than good.
All right. Just to kind of piggyback off of your answer, I've grown very kind of, I don't know, suspicious of citizenship, I think, like over not just the course of the historiography, but over the course of the political moment as well, right? My reading in terms of like, you know, because there's different forms of like, of indigenous, other kind of colonial subjects, have different ways to construct belonging and community formation, right? Beyond the terms of the statistical count of formal citizenship, including the census rolls that I'm studying, number one. But number two, the kind of ramifications of citizenship on the reinforcement of sovereign power over the state and how the state constructs itself, right? So one case study that the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act really inaugurates is that it replaces banishment, which is a much older form of both punishment but also reinforcement of community belonging among indigenous nations, with disenrollment, right? It replaces indigenous forms of kinship, right? Including you know, retribution for the violation of kinship and ethic and the kind of ethics around kinship, with a form of what is tantamount to denaturalization and thus deportation, right? If you scale it up in the ways that the U.S. state applies to different colonial subjects, right? And then likewise, who becomes a citizen and who is reified as a citizen, number one, besides being based on paperwork, right? The kind of basis of who is a good enough subject to be able to have paperwork, right? Like what is erased there is the fact that in order to receive citizenship, or even like receive a green card for that matter, or receive the kinds of visas that have like a kind of dual intent pathway towards receiving a green card and then citizenship, right? These are long dilated processes of state selection, right? That then reinforce among the good immigrants, right? The forms of bad immigrants that are thus disposable, right? And we see this actually scaled down, I think, like in an imperial context, right? With tribal disenrollment, number one, right? And then number two, with like experiments in neo-colonial forms of putative kind of conditional forms of independence and decolonization in the colonies like the Philippines, right? Like citizenship in the Philippines it continues to be debated, and folks might be familiar with that in other contexts as diaspora wars, right? You know, overseas Filipino migrants and Filipino Americans have claims to economic citizenship and to be able to spend in the Philippines without necessarily getting Filipino citizenship, right? And so citizenship here becomes this tactic of state selection, but also becomes a tactic of economic mobilization.
We've also seen that in a lot of our surveys and focus groups, we ask people about who should have a right to vote in things like, you know, the plebiscites or in the Virgin Islands, the Constitutional Convention. And we find it's interesting because we see the debates playing out about, you know, who's a real Virgin Islander. Who, you know, you can vote in the referenda as long as you've been there for three months. If you've been established, you know, if you have a gas bill for 3 months, you can vote in the Constitutional Convention or on the proposed constitution that emerged out of that. Gigi's work really highlights how concerns about displacement, especially like the threat of tourists in Puerto Rico in that context, have really mobilize a different type of identity and coalition. And then we're currently asking, especially in Guam, about, you know, we have these different definitions of the temporal registries and how do those sit with different residents? How important is that to maintain those boundaries, and how fluid do people want those boundaries to be? And so, no clear answer, but definitely really interesting, you know, debates you can see people are navigating here.
And adding quickly to that, residents of the territories are second-class citizens, right? And this is a discourse that's used a lot. But I think it's important to position that there are many groups within the borders of the states of the United States that also consider themselves to be second-class citizens, right? So, and even our focus groups in the U.S. Virgin Islands, we had people go like, oh, like you might like statehood, but have you been to Philadelphia? You know what that is like for Black Americans, for instance. So I think there's something being imagined to what it is, and what full citizenship actually affords or does not afford. And I think there's like some imaginations to be had beyond the concept of citizenship and even potentially beyond the concept of the nation state.
I'll just add that, like, I think what everyone has said so far is like it isn't a clear thing, and it changes so much, and it's sort of sometimes ambiguous or vague. I think that's why I have come to think of it as what I said during the presentation is a relational condition, because I think in every conversation I had with someone, it was something different. I have quotes coming to mind. Someone I talked to was like, citizenship is the US passport and the American dollar. That's all it was. It was like a means to an end. I talked to people who were like, felt like, brought up stories of course, violence and sort of family stories that have been passed down of loss. And so it really just depended, and I feel like that is what I consider, at least right now in the phase I'm in my project, is like my job is in each conversation and in the coding and the sitting with the stories I'm doing now is to understand what each person thinks of all of these concepts as, but it is varying so much. And so I think that makes the work really fulfilling, but also slow, and like I feel like a lot of responsibility to move carefully and to not impose sort of what I do think citizenship is, or what someone, kind of read their story in a different way and stick to what they're saying. So that.
Thanks. Another question I have for you is that your work demonstrates that law has often functioned as a tool of white supremacy and imperial extraction rather than a guarantee of rights. My question here is, how do territorial and colonial subjects navigate and survive legal systems that were never designed for their liberation?
Okay, I'll start just by, I think my answer is pretty brief. I think that the people I spoke to did it creatively, strategically. I think a lot of stories that are coming to mind, folks were pretty fluent in navigating the contradictions as they contended with, making these political lives within structures they didn't choose. And I think that a lot of the people I talked to, maybe that's because they chose to speak with me for my dissertation, but they were thinking about this stuff. They were taking, sort of stepping into some of the advantages while also reckoning with what that meant and dealing with that messiness. And so I would say they, strategically and creatively engaged, but I would, no one I talked to, I would say, was fully accepting or rejecting. They were kind of finding ways to be in the middle, I would say.
I think that a clear answer, there is no real clear answer. I think it's important to highlight that one painfully, in the sense that it is very difficult to live in these spaces under these forms of government where it's already hard to receive essential services, where they don't have the same access to democracy. And that it seems across this conference quite clear that in addition to all these hardships, they're also being displaced further from their resources and their lands and their homes. Something that in our conversations that come up is a lot of hope and imagination, and I feel that the territories are a place that's never really had it easy, and given that in other places of the world, at least they can legally say that they had political decolonization, but that's not the case in the territory. So what we've seen is that people there have never stopped to imagine what decolonization actually means for them. And in Guam in particular, it was amazing to hear the powerhouse of the Chamorro people in imagining what they wanted for them and the region. It was like, oh, hold my notepad. I'm gonna list down my vision for this place. And I think that there's a lot of activists, there are a lot of community leaders, cultural leaders in these places who are doing the very difficult work of making futures and making presence. And I think it's very powerful and very inspiring.
I find this question really generative, in that there's some really exciting scholarship coming out from especially critical legal scholars right now that are trying to flip the script around. You know, the kind of like American political tradition of law tends to be insulated, from its own empire, insular empire, right? Let alone the kind of like ways that the contiguous United States, quote unquote, the lower 48, right, itself is a settler colonial empire, right? And so some of the work that I've been engaging with, you know, the scholars I mentioned before, also Maggie Blackhawk and other folks, right, are trying to flip that script, right, and think about the ways that like an American political and legal and juridical order, right, is actually informed through imperialism, right, even and especially as it takes domestic forms, right, because we tend to think of it. We have tended, and I think like historians of U.S. empire have still tended to think of it as a projection outward, right? Versus the fact that like the states of emergency and states of exception where law is suspended, right, in the colonies where, you know, colonial subjects can feel the direct brunt of sovereign violence. Like those are the places of legal experimentation that come back into the metropole, right? So thinking, for example, but that one of the things I also want to also say here is that that does two things for us. Number one, it allows us to clarify and denaturalize, right, our understanding of American political development and law by subjecting it to a kind of imperial history. For example, like I think and this is stuff I'm trying to do around the New Deal, right, like really intra-imperial relationships and comparisons between different kind of juridical orders, right? So for example, one of the chapters I'm trying to write or think about is you know, kind of Southern Democrats during the New Deal, right, kind of impeding New Deal interventionism and how that relates to things like, you know, the maintenance of kind of conservative plantation capitalism or agribusiness capitalism in California, which then informs Hawaii plantation capitalism and then informs the Philippines, right? But then the other thing, it also opens us to thinking about different kinds of relationships between colonial subjects and how they also not only challenge the law from their own local context, but are learning from each other, right? Like Black and Filipino soldiers during the Philippine-American War are learning how to interact with the American colonial state as it is being formed around them, right? And so I guess like this is all to say, right, like that it's also the malleability of the law, right, and also the malleability of the ways that legal traditions categorize themselves according to geopolitical borders that otherwise the United States wants us to forget about, right? That allows, I think, for more exciting, I think, more urgent interventions into how we understand immigration law, et cetera.
Just very briefly, I'll jump on the point about immigration law to offer a very concrete, local but scale-upable example, which is the question of 287G agreements versus sanctuary cities. So 287G agreements, in short for summarizing here, but are partnerships that municipalities or other entities can have between like local officials, sometimes police departments and ICE, right, to allow for collaboration and information sharing, et cetera. Conversely, I mean, sanctuary cities and policies can look like a number of different things, but they can include, for example, prohibitions or at least sort of friction on local organization with a collaboration with ICE. Right, so this is something that was happening in Arkansas when I was there 10, 15 years ago. It's probably happening in debates, probably happening in many of your hometowns and cities. This question about, you know, the 287G partnerships, they've proliferated very quickly over the past year and a half. How far are we into this? But a question of sanctuary policies as well, because, you know, for example, you know, cities or territories like the USVI, I think that's sort of designated as sanctuary territories, are getting a lot of pushback and retaliation from the federal government right now, including in the territories the threat to withhold federal funds if they maintain their sanctuary status. Now, just to wrap this point up, one thing that I saw, a creative strategy that I saw in Puerto Rico, which was organizations saying, you know, the federal government didn't invent sanctuary, and nobody gets to tell us if we're going to give sanctuary. We're going to draw on older practices, for example, I alluded to earlier, of Puerto Ricans giving sanctuary to their Antillean and Caribbean neighbors who are from sister islands who are escaping from some enslavement, travel to Puerto Rico. We're given, creating maroon communities. We're hidden in Afro-Caribbean churches, right, throughout places like Santurce. And so, like, saying, we can make sanctuary, we can do a DIY sanctuary. It doesn't have to be something we get the approval from the government. And I think that's a kind of creative, kind of a critical legal strategy, maybe at a local scale.
Okay, we only have 5 minutes. So my last question for you is, beyond your roles as researchers, many of you have deep personal and ancestral ties to the islands you study. Drawing on both your scholarships and your lived experience, how are you working to imagine freedom from inside the cage?
I'll go ahead since we only have 5 minutes. So I am from Aguadilla, Puerto Rico, and I didn't grow up learning about the other territories of the United States. I think that's not uncommon among Puerto Ricans here in attendance, and I think that in all these places, people have grown up hearing these very negative narratives about possibilities, right? That to the point of others here are largely weaponized, and we've been taught these things as children. And I think a way that it's been helpful for me to imagine has also been to decenter Puerto Rico. But it's also sometimes even talked about in the archipiélago as like the last colony in the world, and it isn't. I think in conversations with other places that have been thinking about this from very different angles and very different experiences, and even in a point of like less advantage than Puerto Rico itself, has for me personally opened a lot of ways to imagine and to hope in collaboration. So thinking beyond survival as like the unitary place, but how these places together, territories and not, can converse with each other and kind of build each other up. That's one piece.
Okay, I'll jump in. I think it was one of your interlocutors in your papers that said something about like imperialism, the colonization of the imagination, right? Which is thus the colonization of the ability to imagine a future. And what is that if not a kind of colonial nationalism, right? I think a lot of my work has been based hitherto around like the disaggregation of the nation and the state, but also this aggregation of indigenous subjects who become erased by ethno-national categories, either through migration or through kind of like nationalisms, right? And so one of the things in my work I've been trying to do, really to self-soothe, right, in the kind of like contemporary crises today, is like trying to imagine different futures beyond the nation state, right? And thinking that so one of the ways I defined the nation state, right, was that like the state is a kind of like administrative technology of the collection and distribution of resources that enforces itself through sovereign violence, right? The nation, right, is that kind of like imaginative way, like Benedict Anderson-esque, right, that ways people imagine kind of kinships across territory through print media, et cetera, right? The state uses nationalism in order to justify itself as being there since time immemorial, right? Whereas it's actually a technology of domination, right, and extraction, and thus reinforcing certain, forms of white and ethno-supremacist forms of like property relations and regimes, right? The hyphen, and I'm summarizing here from my most recent book, Public Buy-In, out of the University of Washington Press. What I argue is that the hyphen of the nation state is race, right? Like race and racism is the way through which states are able to coagulate nations and like fealty around them in order to justify themselves, right? And so when we think, if coming from the Filipino and Filipino diaspora context, the Filipino subject tends to have a nostalgia around it, right? Like it was formed in the late 19th century, right? Like it was an articulation against Spanish imperial ideas of racialization, and natives took it up and formed a coalition with mestizo and Creole elites to stage a revolution against Spain, and then yay, the Americans came in 1898 and promised us freedom, and then oh shit, they took over, right? And then they promised us freedom, right? In 1916, 1934, et cetera, right? So freedom becomes a technique of colonization and domination, right? And so one of the things that, and so I've grown deeply suspicious of like the ethno-racial and ethno-nationalist category in the Filipino context as a form of, as a unit political organizing. Which is not to say to discard it altogether, but to think about what other kinds of resources can we mobilize, both in relation to it, right? Filipinos as the kind of disposable workers of the world that, you know, power the petrostates around, you know, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Canada, et cetera, right? Like, could we mobilize Filipinos in that way, right? For a different kind of revolutionary freedom, or anti-capitalist freedom, right? As a resource that we have for the time being, versus this is kind of like permanent, eternal political horizon of a pure Filipino ethno-national subject.
I'll just say quickly that, first of all, Carmen, this is such a beautiful question. When I got it, I was like, wow. Like, I really appreciate the opportunity to think about it. I think it really helps me to be grounded in critical feminists, abolitionists, and indigenous thinkers, scholars, community members who show us that freedom is already here in our small and big actions. So that's just one thing I always carry with me. In terms of being in academia, I really take a lot of just like praxis from the book A Third University by Law Paperson. It's available for free online, open source. And across my personal and professional life, I ask myself what kind of future ancestor do I want to be, and then I just constantly figure out and refigure out how I try to make that happen, and have a lot of humility if I mess up or you know, along the way, which is bound to happen. So that'll be fair.
Just very briefly, I'm on sabbatical right now, so I'm not teaching, but when I was teaching last year, I found great emotion and inspiration and hope in my students, especially my international students who are involved with organizing for Gaza, and in great bravery. And I think it's sort of thinking as an educator about the positionalities that they occupied as international students, primarily international students who are organizing around Palestine, and including undocumented students. That was incredibly brave, and I think just kind of that process of relationality pushed me in thinking about the multiple different fronts of decolonization and anti sort of genocide, anti-white supremacy that we can engage in and support our students in engaging in without always expecting them to make themselves the most vulnerable.
Something that I've been really excited to be able to do is try to decenter like continental universities and control over narratives. So working with la Universidad de Puerto Rico to build access as like representative survey, and it'd be so fun for me to just control this whole instrument and add questions that I want. But the point was to make sure people, like students at the university, could, you know, shape and form their own research questions, and so they've been able to use it and to publish their own work, and to use the resources that tend to be more available at R1 institutions to support the dissemination of other students' research, instead of just, I think it's so easy for us to just be like, I need to publish more, but to use our resources to really center other people's work who don't have that same access.
Thank you so much. We are now open the floor for questions. Please scan the QR code to ask your questions. Rosa?
Okay, so a question from Andrew. For the capacity question of the third presentation, how do you delineate between the lack of imagination of what an independent island would look like versus an earnest desire to capitalize on the economic incentives of being associated with a larger country like the U.S.?
We really try to like remain pretty agnostic about what preference, whether people want to be a freely associated state or independent or a U.S. state, and say the point is not that, you know, you should prefer this because, you know, we have our own preferences, but to say you should definitely feel like you have more than one option. And our biggest concern is that the majority of the residents in a really large representative survey do not feel they could survive in any option that was not dependent on the U.S. So I think it is totally reasonable to say, like, you know, we think our best path or our best option is to maintain an alliance with the U.S. But that is a different choice to say, I prefer that without having another option versus, I know we could do it as an independent state, but I think this is the best option for us. And so our goal is to say, you should have multiple options. And the U.S. is responsible for ensuring you have multiple options.
Okay. So, a question from B. Valentin. Does geographic disconnect between diasporas of the territories and the territories themselves, Alaska, Marshall Islands, New York, Puerto Rico, for example, play a role in impeding the pursuit of political imagination of citizenship with and without the U.S.?
As the geographer, I'll take track of that. I thought a lot about this because I spent a lot of time thinking about and working with social movements that are in diaspora and so very dispersed geographically. I think that first of all, context really matters. Chandra has writing with a collaborator whose name I'm forgetting, forgive me, that like organizing has to be not site limited but site specific and grounded in the specificities of place. So what does that mean when we're organizing across different places? I think it looks a lot like this, and I think it looks a lot about the work that many of you are doing to kind of go and sit with people in different places, have these conversations in person. That also means that kind of when we're building movements that are geographically dispersed or diasporic, they have to slow down to work at the speed of relationship building. It's hard and slow. This is admittedly challenging, I think, when the advance of imperialism and military occupations and ICE raids seems to not just be growing, but accelerating every day. That speed, so many of my interviewees and just comrades, we've been talking about how fast it feels like everything is happening and expanding and getting worse. And so I think it really takes a lot of work and faith to like slow way down to connect with each other and build in ways that are, I don't know, that can respect that. And that includes paying attention to things like our fatigue, our embodiment of, of our meals together.
Something that in one of our conversations, this is something that she has talked about more publicly. Yes, of course. We talked with Monique Watson and from the Virgin Islands, and something that she told us that she encountered is the fact that these islands have been colonized by very different empires and therefore speak very different languages. So even that can complicate conversations among people in the territories and among islands in general, even if they are in the same region. And something that was mentioned in a panel yesterday that we've also found is how difficult it is to travel between these islands. It could be cheaper to go to Florida than it is to travel between the Lesser Antilles, for example, or between Guam and Saipan. And that is so infuriating and ridiculous. Because again, like going back to the theme of the conference, our Sea of Islands, like the premise of that essay is how travel was permitted across all of these different places in ways that made them seem bigger and more powerful. But when these places are isolated from each other, both in language and just difficulty in traveling in ways that have been done historically, it really limits or makes it harder for there to be solidarity networks. In addition to, sometimes the other places are even excluded from the history books certain of these islands read. So I think that's why conversations like these are very important, and reaching out to these other places are very important. Sharing resources are very important. because there are structural factors that are not accidental that have made these interactions much more difficult than they have been in the past or that they need to be.
I'll speak from the Philippine case, right? I think the way to distill it, it's not necessarily, besides like the kind of economic resources around who is able to go back and like, you know, like be able to cultivate these relations with like activists at home, for example, especially in the southern Philippines. It's also something that is interesting that at the core of, in the Philippine case, at the core of like Philippine national politics is always this fraught relationship with diaspora, right? And for diasporic activists and also diasporas who try to connect back home, right? Like, what is mitigating your relationship back home? If it's a question of like rediscovery and authentic culture and identity, well, that's just imperial, right? Like, there's a lot of like non-indigenous Filipinos in diaspora that take on indigenous garb and pretend they're indigenous Filipinos. Like, this is the pretendianism is a global thing, right? That is mitigated through U.S. imperial logics of like ethnology and racism, right? Also thinking about that, like the global tourism ambassador for the Marcos regime in the Philippines, bless you, is High School Musical star Vanessa Hudgens, right? Who and yeah, that's her grift. Yeah, she's interesting, right? But also, right, that a lot of like indigenous and allied indigenous kind of like pro-indigenous activism in the Philippines, right? Right now, Siargao, the island of Siargao, is being occupied by Israel. Right, and a lot of what's going on there right now is that they're appealing to diaspora as well, right, to make visible, but also come back and like be able to like, you know, defend land and territory, etc. So the diaspora is always at the center of, I think, like that kind of relational radical organizing in the Philippines, right, as much as it is in the center of the kind of neo-fascist projects around Philippine nationalism and territoriality.
Before we go, I want to open the floor to Dr. Mara of she has a question for the audience and the fellow panelists.
I mean, to everybody, you know, we concluded, we really tried to shift perceptions of viability, and our effort failed. But that's also an opportunity to hear from you. Like, do you think that it's just infeasible to share a narrative, and that's unlikely to reshape perceptions of political viability, or do you think there's alternative narratives that we should be considering? I guess we're just looking for feedback on what you think might be more effective.
Hi, sorry, I'll stand up. I was the volunteer to ask that question. Thank you. I was actually a student of Professor Vanessa Diaz's course at Layla Marymount, Bad Bunny, History of Resistance in Puerto Rico. CENTRO had an event for them a little while ago. And I think something that always stuck out from me from taking that course was that how hard it is to really change, like, especially the ideas that Puerto Ricans in the diaspora and also like on the island have, like this just reliance of thinking about, you know, independence is not possible without the United States. And I think what I would offer as an alternative is what my professor said, which was the one time that statehood should have worked was after Hurricane Maria, and it didn't. Like, that was the example, and I think like seeing that, like, if there was any time like statehood could have worked and benefited us the most, that was like the time it failed us like the most. And I think like hearing that and kind of rooting it, I think sometimes whenever I have, you know, I'm having conversations like with my abuela and abuelo, I'm like, guys, you know, and I think trying to educate them, but I think you just kind of have to bring it back to like what they know, because it's just very like, I think it also speaks to like the isolation of islands and the inability, like the struggle with building solidarity networks. And I also think like referencing like, you know, communities of Puerto Ricans in the diaspora that face like isolation and also face a lot of uphill battles with unemployment, with housing issues, that they are very parallel the issues of Puerto Ricans that are on the island themselves and still experiencing. So I definitely think that's just an alternative that I would offer.
We can have one more person.
Hi everyone, my name is Tatiana Neves Brown. I'm a visual anthropologist and thinking a lot about questions of futurity through design and kind of tactile ways of thinking about the future, because I've noticed maybe similar things where when I raise these questions with friends or with family or with the homies or just meeting people on the street, thinking about futurity can sometimes feel literally just like far from the body. And so one of the things that I find that I keep coming back to is like, what are the sort of artifacts that we can have from the future and how can we make them now? I was thinking about a comment that you made about people desiring like a physical passport or like a physical American dollar or like a physical seal on a document that is some way to confirm some distant relationship to some distant structure in DC back to us. And I think that the question of the materials that we use and hold and relate with and how they confirm a political reality to us is like something that I'm curious to explore more among artists and designers. And that's not to say that, and that's also not to do the thing of like, you have to go through some design school, whatever, to make it, to say, literally physically making things that are symbols of the future in the present moment. So that's, I think that's maybe a reflection of what I've been trying to say.
We don't have more time. So thank you for your questions, and I want to thank the panelists. I really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you. And now Rosa has more information